Knoll Nation, welcome into another episode of the Renegade Rundown. As always, to my right is the beautiful and lovely Jen Santy, aka at Jen Santy 1890 on X. And today's guest is a special guest. His name is Jason Staples. A lot of folks know him as Doc Staples. Dude's been, we were just talking about it before the show. I believe he started his podcast around 2010, 2011. Sometime back then, he used to run the Florida State Scout website. The guy has been around the Florida State beat for a long, long time. I've been a big fan of his podcast. It's called the Unconquered podcast. I believe he's available on all platforms as far as audio goes. Thanks for joining us, Jason. What's going on, man?
It's good to be here. And we were just talking about how, I'm available on a lot of audio stuff, but I'm getting to the place where I'm admiring a lot of your graphics and the graphics of a lot of others that have joined this space since I started doing it. It was a little after, I think it was 2012 or 2013 when I first started. So, but yeah, I've been around a long time doing it, and it's amazing to watch all the people entering this stuff now and some of the things that that folks can do in terms of graphics and all of that I'm getting to be a bit of an old head, and it's feel a little different now.
Yeah, I'm not like any kind of savant. Don't get me wrong. I'm like pretty good if you put me in a group of just regular people. Like, I've got a little bit of skills, but we were just talking about it before. Like, technology has helped a lot. AI has been my best friend because like the things that used to take me 10, 15 hours in web design class back in 2009, like you can do in 10 minutes just with AI today. So it's come a long ways, but like I said, we sure appreciate you jumping on. Before we get into the whole ACC mess, I guess we could just let us know what you got going on, man. You got any podcasts coming out? How's everything going on your end?
I'm overdue to get an episode out. These days in the off season, I tend to get overdue, but that's the way it works. But yeah, I'll get one out here soon. Looking at a couple of additional pickups that have happened out of the portal since I last recorded, and then looking at the updated. I'll also do some looking at the updated ACC filing and do an update on the cases there. I actually have a very good attorney who is going to be coming on and helping explain through some of that for those of us without Esquire after our names. So yeah, there'll be a whole lot coming, and then I've got some video content that'll be hitting those channels as well, because I'm going to be starting to go through some of the things that I didn't really want to mess with, looking at the Georgia game and some of that stuff in terms of breakdowns of all that, but it's time to actually revisit some of that, regardless of how ugly it is, and take a look at some of that and some of the pickups that they're bringing in, and evaluating how they fit within the system, that sort of thing. So usual off-season stuff.
Yeah, man, we had a pretty blessed season there, but yeah, that one was pretty rough. That is definitely the not so fun part of it. I did a post game show live after every game, and yeah, that one was tough. Luckily, I had Jen there next to me, but we got through it and on to better times. But I guess we can start there before we get into the ACC stuff. You mentioned the portal, and we just got another guy from Harvard, and Jacob Rizzi. I guess we can start there, the most recent guy. Seen some guys project him as a center. Some people think he'll be depth at tackle. I'm not so sure. Like, some people are pushing for him to be a starter. I'm not really convinced. We'll have to see what happens when he gets here and to compete. But definitely a body. And if Alex Atkins is going to bring a guy in, I'm nobody to question him. Like, he obviously sees something there. So I'm interested to see what he can do out of spring. So I'm interested to see what you think about him. And if there's anybody, I guess you can go right into after that, like a particular person that sticks out or you think could really help us next year out of the portal.
Yeah, I mean, I think Rizzi is an interesting addition there, because he does bring a big body, and when you look at the Harvard tape, he moves pretty well with that frame. He's a wide guy and does move well. And one of the things that really feel like they were not able to do this last year is pull as well, especially with where they were at guard. But they had some trouble as a team. Norvell likes to run a lot of counter. They like to run, down G. It's kind of a pin and pull play on the edge, And you have to have guys that can move to be able to do that stuff well. And there were just too many times this year where they just didn't handle their pulls especially well. And that was both at guard and tackle. Tackles got a little banged up, which was part of it. But they want to get they wanted to get more athletic and also stronger on the interior. And I think with the three additions that they've made there with Ferguson, Leonard, and Rizzi, they've at least added good depth, and they've added some size and some guys that can move a little bit there to be able to allow them to do some of those things. And Rizzi's interesting because I think what you're basically getting with him is a guy that can play all five positions, and those guys end up being pretty valuable. Especially in a 16 game season. I mean, they're not trying to build for, an 11 or 12 game season anymore. With the 12 team playoff, if you're going to make it all the way, you're going to play 16 games. So you'd better have sufficient depth to be able to survive, and that means more than just having a guy who can come in. If somebody goes down, it means having a guy who can be in a rotation so that you can basically load manage your season. And having that kind of guy who's got the ability to come in and play multiple spots and eat up reps over the course of the season is really important. You've got to have, 9, 10 guys that you really trust on the offensive line to be able to do that all year, or you start getting banged up and guys get nagging injuries and then you get beat. And then you get to the end of the year and you're not healthy enough to be able to contend with teams that have the depth to have been able to keep themselves in better shape. So a guy like Rizzi is critical just for that. And interestingly, North Carolina, which is the other team that I've covered for, a decade, is they had a transfer from Harvard as well a couple of years ago, who started at tackle the last 2 years for them and was actually a above replacement level tackle in the ACC the last 2 years. He was one of their two best offensive linemen this year for sure. I mean, it wasn't a great offensive line, but he wasn't a major liability. And I don't think Rizzi is worse than he is. I think he's around the same caliber player. So I think you're getting a guy that should be able to get right into that rotation and be able to be a factor. And ideally, with his size, he's north of 300. He's about 305. And has some good width to him. Ideally, he's a guy that can give you some burn at center, where they brought in somebody to challenge for the center role the last 3 years.
They've been trying to get beat Maurice out, but he keeps holding that thing down. That's why I'll believe it when I see it, because Maurice keeps winning that shot, that position. And you mentioned about them liking to run counter and having a little bit of issues with guys, and that's a natural transition into Richie. Richie Leonard, I'm drawing a blank. The guard Leonard from Florida. Yeah, Richie Leonard, because he has great feet. Was probably the best guard they had. And along those lines, how much they like to run that counter G. I think you could see a real actual counter game this year. It was like, we just loved the counter so much. It was pretty much just power G. I'm not sure if that's what they called it, if they always called it counter or not, because it's not really counter if you're just like, everybody knows that's where you're going with it every play. You know what I mean? But I think we could see a lot more duo, like a lot more double teams on the line, and like catch guys off guard with that more, I guess. Be more balanced with the run game, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Well, it's still counter, because counter is really about the blocking scheme.
Right.
It has to do with who's pulling and who's got a double team block and that sort of thing. So who's pulling, who's responsible for the kick out, who's got the double team. That's all counter blocking. And so it's still counter. And G is a different play. From G is basically outside zone, but instead of the offensive tackle on a reach block on the outside, the offensive tackle pins on the inside, pins usually a 3 technique on the inside, so the defensive tackle or a tight front end guy. So the offensive tackle is going to pin that guy, and you're going to pull the guard to be able to get the edge, and he'll either kick out that edge or try to flank him. So that's a separate play altogether. That the down or G play that's coming out of like single wing stuff, but. Yeah, they're going to be able to run, I think, more of that with the personnel that they're bringing in. They just were not real fleet of foot at guard last year. And actually the best guy they had, I mean, I ran the numbers on this in terms of, when they had the most success with different lineups on the field. the best guy they had last year at guard was Keandre Jones. He had the best splits in terms of success in the running game and overall success in the passing game. And, he got banged up and was a little inconsistent at times himself. But at least with him, they knew they were not going to get run over. They knew they kind of knew what getting with him, and they were able to call to his strengths. I think with this group, you've got a little bit more flexibility. And like I said, they're your best case scenario is that Rizzy can give you some snaps at center. I mean, even if it's not a matter of winning that center job, if you can have a guy that can steal 200, 250 snaps at center from Maurice Smith, that helps him keep from getting banged up and keep from getting worn down over the course of the year. I mean, even if that's just taking, additional snaps in practice, even that
maybe you
helps.
can rest him against a lesser team, and let Rizzy take over the game. I agree.
So that gives you a lot of benefits. Now, Leonard was the best lineman on the Florida team. I mean, you could tell that by the reaction of a couple of the other guys that went into the portal. And those guys were like, yeah, he was the best guy. We went against him, all year in practice, et cetera. So, the staff knew that, and they went and they got the best player on Florida's offensive line. And I fully expect Leonard to be a plug and play starter at that point. And then you got some guys that you feel pretty good about. As far as running duo, they actually started running more duo and that sort of thing toward the end of this year, partly because they weren't running counter very well. And when they started getting Keandre Jones on the field, he's not super fluid as a puller, but what he can do is mash. And with duo, if you're really big inside, you can start to line up and get some of those double teams and give your backs some reads and get vertical displacement and get yardage. And that's what they did. So they adjusted to that. I wouldn't be surprised to see them continue to run some duo next year, but I do think they want to get back to a little bit more of a game of the running game that is designed to get a little bit more of a big play rate, which is going to be some of that stuff that's going to pull.
For sure. Jen, did you have a question?
No, I like the stuff on Rizzy. I really kind of had questions about Tyler Ferguson for me.
Terrence.
That's one or Terrence, yeah. I'm really interested in him. Where do you see him being plugged in?
Well, I think Leonard is a plug and play starter.
Yeah.
I think Ferguson has to prove that he can play to be a starter. And I think he's got the physical tools to be one of the best guys on the team. When you look at what he brings to the table as an athlete, he's a really talented athlete. Great feet, a lot of the things that you look for in terms of traits. But I'm not sure how tough he is yet. And if you look at some of the Bama reps that he had, I've got some questions there, and he's going to have to earn his spot, and he's going to have to beat out a guy like Keandre Jones. And right now, on my sort of internal depth chart that I use for myself, I'm presuming that Ferguson is he's the number 3 guard behind Leonard and Keandre Jones. That's presuming that Jones is able to stay healthy, drop a few pounds, and get in a little better shape over the course of the offseason. But then Ferguson ends up being sort of the rotational guy that rotates in there the way that Jones did this year. And I do think thinking of things in terms of starters is a little bit outdated now with the way that they're approaching things with this team. It has to do with whether or not you're actually a rotational player. Because you look at how they did things on the defensive line last year, the starters and backups at defensive tackle. Yeah, well, yeah, and offensive line too. But the starters and backups at defensive tackle played almost the same number of snaps. And the backup linebackers last year played about a third of the snaps. So you're looking at it. They're really trying to rotate a lot of guys, which is one way to keep guys happier. First of all, to keep more of your roster happy. But again, they are scheming. They're game planning. They're season planning for the end of the year, and that's going to be a really important piece. You better basically have 4 starting guards, you better have 5 guys that are rotating on the interior and 4 guys that are rotating at your tackles to be able to make it through a 16 game season. And they're trying to build a roster that can do that.
Yeah, I agree. That's huge. We've been talking about it for a long time. You got to have 10 guys, 10, 12 guys. And my kind of thing, you kind of mentioned it in your explanation there, but I'll kind of point a light on it. Seems like we went from a squad, and you heard about it all preseason, 2,000 starts and such experience across the top 8 guys. Feels like we had a bunch of guys who were kind of maxed out at their ability, had all this experience going into this year. You have, a bit of a lower floor due to inexperience and stuff, but you have more guys like Keandre Jones that if they get a hold of you, they're going to mash. I feel like you may have some growing pains in the, at the beginning, but it's my inclination, and just from what I see, that you're going to end up having a higher end unit by the end of the year. Unless you have, catastrophic injuries, you can never, predict those kind of things. But I just see more of a more talent on the hoof. When they come off the bus, they're going to look a little bit more like what you'd expect to be one of those top lines in the nation, rather than just being crafty and all the stereotypes that you hear.
It depends a little bit, because I mean, they're still, I think right now they're slated to start 5 seniors on the offensive line and have their sixth guy be another senior. So you're still basically working with a lot of the same guys as last year. You're just adding a couple outside guys as rotational players at guard at this point. The question is who from the young group, and there is some real talent in that younger group, who actually is able to earn the trust to become a part of that rotation. I mean, can a Lucas Simmons, who didn't practice much last year due to some health stuff that he's finally gotten clear of, can a Lucas Simmons take a big step forward and earn some reps this year?
Yeah.
Jalen Earl is a guy that I think they expect a lot from this year in terms of being able to be a guy that rotates a lot. Is there someone else, maybe an Andre Otto? I mean, who else steps in and is able to prove that he's trustworthy to be a part of that rotation? Because all of those guys have higher ceilings in terms of the kind of talent they brought in. And they also didn't play really super early to get banged up and hurt, which, kills development on the offensive line. So that's all part of the process. But the big thing is that they've got to figure out what 10 guys they can trust, and hopefully they can get 10 guys they trust.
Absolutely. I know one of Jen's favorite guys. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Are you about to bring him up? Because is it
a running back?
Grady Kelly? No.
Okay, no, but
Grady
we can
Kelly.
get to Grady Kelly first for sure.
Yeah, I like Grady Kelly, and I mean, I don't really know why. I mean, I think I don't know. I think he just has this blue collar type offensive lineman thing going for him that I can't explain who he reminds me of, but I feel like it could be like a Dylan Gibbons type replacement. And maybe that's just me, but I really like this take for them. I wanted to see if you had any thoughts on Grady Kelly.
Go ahead.
When I first looked at Grady Kelly, my evaluation was basically that they're getting a slightly upgraded Malcolm Ray with an extra year of eligibility. So, he's not a Braden Fisk at this stage. He doesn't bring that kind of combination of size and explosion. I don't think he's as long as Fisk is either. So, he's a little more limited physically than what you got with Fisk. And a little bit sawed off, kind of like Ray is, but he's got good quickness and carries his weight pretty well. He's going to have to gain a little bit of weight, I think, in this offseason to be exactly where he wants to be going into a power 4 type schedule. But I think you can basically get out of him what they got out of Malcolm Ray last year, but with a little bit better, I think, overall return. And
since you're got a couple years left too.
Yeah, I just wanted to explain, when I said Dylan Gibbons, it was because when we got him on the offensive line, to me, this for the defense for him, it kind of seems almost like the same, just kind of like blue collar, kid that just wants to come to work. And
that's what I started to say. He's from Navarre, Florida, so he's from right here in the Panhandle. He is definitely a good kid from what I've heard and everybody I've talked to.
I probably should have explained it a little better, but for me, it was almost like getting the Dylan Gibbons for the defensive side, just for that reason.
I can understand that.
Yeah. That's
sticking with the running game. We bring in Roydell Williams. I'm really, really excited about him. He may not have the top speed, the game breaking ability if he does get to the second level like a Trey Benson, But as far
Many
as
have
being a
Trays.
patient runner, to be patient, and then find the right gap and hit it, I absolutely love what I've seen on tape of him against Alabama. Curious, think what kind of replacement level you get from him versus a Trey Benson.
Yeah, I think what you're getting with Roydell is a guy that is going to get you more consistency carry to carry than what you typically got from Trey, but significantly less explosiveness. The other thing though that I think Roydell brings is he was an amazing, just an outstanding special teams player for Alabama as well. He was one of their special teams aces. And he, just by his presence on the team, is going to make this Florida State team better on the special teams side. That's an underrated thing. I mean, that he may end up being a long-term NFL guy, multiple years in the NFL, just because of how good he is as a special teamer, and how hard he plays at that level. But he's got really good vision, which I think is one of those traits that just doesn't get appreciated enough. But I think what you're getting with him is somebody that in a lot of ways replaces kind of the Trayshawn Ward role,
Yeah.
but with an extra 15 or 20 pounds compared to Ward. So he's a bigger body. Actually, he's probably, 25 pounds heavier than Ward. But he's that kind of instinctive, visionary, bursty runner who really has, that kind of back has had historically a lot of success in Norvell offenses. And you have that with a guy that's 215, 220 pounds. So I think that really helps in terms of giving you somebody that together with DJ Uiagalelei allows you to have a steady run game presence with how you've built out your offensive line and be able to do a lot between the tackles. And really, I mean, I think Roydell in a lot of ways basically serves as the bridge to Cameron Davis, who I think I would not be surprised to see Cameron Davis end up being the lead rusher for Florida State this year. I think he's that good. I think he's basically
I love it.
I think he's basically a Cam Akers or better level player as a freshman.
Man, I've said the same thing and I get flack. People are like, oh man, that's high praise, but it's like they were both quarterback. I've watched the tape. They play quarterback similar to like how each other played. It's like so many simulators. And if you've seen the kid, I've met him 2 or 3 times. He's huge.
Yeah, he's 220 pounds, coming in, more physically ready than just about any backs do.
3% body fat.
I had a friend coach against him in high school, who basically he texted me, he said, "Dude, that guy, he's going to be ready right away. He's really, really good." And this guy that played at Florida State too. He's like he's going to be day one type player. And I don't hear that from him very often. When he says that about a high school player, I mean, guys that he said that about are guys like Caleb Downs, Josh Downs, who he coached against both of those guys, and Cameron Davis. I mean, those are the kind of guys I hear stuff like that from him about, which, that's really, really good company. So, I think Davis is one of those guys that, what you want to do is ease him into it. You don't want to burn him out early in the season, and freshmen tend to hit a wall. You really want Davis to kind of find his feet about mid-year and start getting carries mid-year and really start to take control toward the second half of the year when he, with fresh legs as a freshman. That's ideal. And what Roydell Williams gives you is a guy to kind of bridge to that and then continue to be a part of that rotation in the second half of the year where you can stay fresh at that back with those backs.
Yeah, I agree. And we've got commenters saying, don't forget Toafili. And look, we could talk about every guy on the thing, but the show's just so long. So we're going to try to get through the transfer people. But yeah, I agree. I love the fact that Toafili's coming back. He's going to be great. I think kind of what Jason was alluding to. We've got a stable of backs that's going to put it to where Cam doesn't. He's not going to be pressed into forced to be relied upon, but they're going to let him get carries and he can take it at his own speed. When he's ready for him, he can get them. That's great. But I heard DJ Uiagalelei's name mentioned, and we can talk him. We can talk the passing game. I think the biggest connection, maybe the biggest addition out of the portal, is going to end up being Malik Benson. So talk me off the ledge. Tell me why the dude isn't going to be an All-American and All-ACC and all this stuff. And the only reason he wasn't last year is because Jalen Milroe is his quarterback.
Well, I don't know about All American, but I do think Malik Benson. This coaching staff loved Benson coming out of JUCO, and were
Hmm.
disappointed when he went to Alabama the first time. And I think there's high hopes for him. And they felt like coming out of last year, as good as Keon and Johnny Wilson were, they felt like they needed to add a more of a speed dimension to this offense to be able to do some of the things that they want to do downfield. And they've built a specific kind of offense, basically built on what DJ does well. Uh, and that's something that Norvell is really good at. Norvell has historically called his offenses very well to the skill set of his quarterbacks. I mean, Jordan Travis, in a lot of ways, was not the prototypical Mike Norvell quarterback. They tailored what they did to what Jordan does well, and Jordan became a really really good player in that offense. DJ brings a different kind of skill set to the table, and with his skill set having basically the ability to run the football between the tackles and then play action and hit some shots down the field, especially down the field on verticals, on the seams, and your kind of post climb concept that or what's in the pros called a Yankee concept. That That's the sort of thing that they're going to want to do, and DJ does all of that really well. I mean, he's got a huge arm. He's capable of making really good big time throws down the field when he's off play action. You just don't want to ask him to do a lot of air raid type stuff, the sort of things that you would do with a guy like Cam Ward. He's a different kind of player. So what they did is they built around what DJ can do. He's going to give you some opportunities in the running game with quarterback power, sort of between the tackle stuff. He's going to be able to push the ball down the field. So they went and they got Malik Benson as a guy that you can't overthrow, and a guy that in the screen game becomes a guy that's a weapon as well. So he fits what they need as that additional piece as well as anybody they could have gotten. I mean, he's a sub 10 500 meters in his history, and you put him out there with a Hakeem Williams and a Destin Hill and a Kentron Poitier and Darian Williamson, and these are all bigger body guys, but none of them are 10-4, 10-5 guys in the 100 meters. You add that additional player, and even if he doesn't turn into an All-American in terms of statistically, and I think they're going to rotate receivers enough that getting that statistically is going to be difficult. Even if he doesn't do that, the impact of a guy who can take the top off a defense that way and require additional attention, the impact of that on the rest of the receiving squad is really significant, and it opens things up for DJ and for those backs and all of that. And that's why I think he's a critical addition to this. And he's also a really soft-handed guy. I mean, I was impressed by his hands when I evaluated him.
For sure. That's kind of an embarrassment of riches. You bring in a guy like Jalen Lucas, you bring back Ja'Kai Douglas. You mentioned Destin Hill. You get another guy, Jalen Brown, who was kind of the guy coming out who was like, do we get Jalen Brown or Hakeem Williams? Now you get both of them. Kind of like you have to keep a ton of linemen. Mike Norvell and this offense, they're going to keep a lot of wide receivers. I've seen like people kind of grunting and getting a little upset with how many receivers we take. But it's like when you run 3 and 4 and even go wide, empty sometime with 5 wide and got guys running down the field, and just how much blocking and how much physicality they use. The guys, you see it. And we got down to like 1 or 2 scholarship wide receivers in one of the games last year. The guys were also beat up. So I've got no problem with it. And I love it. I love the different guys they brought in for sure.
Well, I mean, you just think about last year. I mean, how many guys got banged up? Johnny missed 2 games. Keon missed a game and had a bone bruise that impacted his whole second half of the year. Hakeem missed multiple games. Kentron Poitier was hurt first half of the year and got dinged up late as well. Yeah. Destin Hill missed multiple games and was hurt, toward the tail end of the season. Darian Williamson missed multiple games. Deuce Spann was, got hurt a little bit. So you start to go down the list, and you better have some depth at that kind of position, because
absolutely
you don't want to be on your 5th or 6th guy that you don't trust. You need to do in this era of football, and I think Mike Norvell understands this, is you need to bring in as much talent as you can and let the guys settle who's going to play.
Absolutely.
That's, get as much talent in every room as you can and let those guys figure out what the pecking order is going to be and who's going to be that dog. That's what you have to do.
Facts. I could not agree more. Jen?
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. And I go back to the Pitt game. They were down, 7 wide receivers, and you looked at the halftime score. I mean, you can't function losing that many skilled players in a game, honestly. I mean, and so it is a nice thing to have that type of depth, right? I mean, if you're going to keep bringing them in and they want to come, bring them. Because that game, that was where you needed all this depth that the people are whining about. Guess what? You don't want to lose to a team like Pitt. And that was a perfect ingredient for that to happen that day. I mean, you look at all the injuries you talk about on the offensive line, you talk about the wide receivers, it was late in the year. All of these things could have gone into losing that game. And if you want to complain about taking too many wide receivers, cool. But guess what? Sometimes you need it. You do. And Jaylen Brown wants to be here. Come on. I don't see the problem. I really don't. I don't think this is a bad problem to have.
Hell no, in another place.
That these kind of guys are foundational for your coverage units because they're guys that are long and can run. So,
good point.
when you have guys, like a LaWayne McCoy who played both receiver and DB in high school, when he's not in the rotation right away as a receiver, he may well be in the rotation as a gunner or as a kickoff coverage guy and these sorts of things. And you need to have guys that can run and get guys on the ground on those units. So, you need to fill out your roster with some of those guys.
No doubt. And another position you want to talk about stacking up depth. Folks are a little worried. And I promise we won't spend the whole show on this reviewing just the guys we've got, and we'll be quicker on the defense. But I could talk to Jason about football all day, so this is awesome.
Yeah.
But defensive end, we brought in 3 guys on defensive end. It's the all-name team. We bring in Sione Lolohea, Tomiwa Dorojaye, and Marvin Jones Jr. Save the easiest one for last. 3 studs, man. The high ceiling probably is going to be Marvin Jones Jr., but I really like the size on Sione Lolohea. I think Toko could probably slide inside a little bit like DeMarcus Walker did when he was here. And Tomiwa, I think he's more I haven't watched enough film on him, but I have heard great things about his ability and kind of his ceiling. But really interested your opinion on the pass rushers.
Well, I mean, the main thing is that they needed to get guys, and it's not even as much about pass rushes. They needed to get guys that could hold up on the edge in the running game.
Yeah.
So the big issue for Florida State is that they like to run a light box. They like to be they had the number 1 pass coverage defense in the country last year, partly because they were able to stick with 6 guys, sometimes 5 guys in the box on a regular basis and still stop the run last year. And that allows you to lock down on the wide receivers with your 3 main corners and to, do some things with your safeties that take away the pass. The problem is that they lacked depth on the edge with guys who could hold up against the run last year. And the numbers were really clear on this. I mean, I talked about this on the Unconquered podcast and, posted it up on Twitter a while back as well. Before the Georgia game, actually, I was kind of warning about this might not be so good given, at least a couple of the opt-outs.
Gilbert didn't pan out, really. That was a big hit there on the edge.
Gilbert was a significant decline, and the discrepancy between when Jared Verse was on the field and when he wasn't sort of reveals this. When Jared Verse was on the field, and the game, so ruling out garbage time. So we're just going to talk about when the score was within 17 points. Okay, when Jared Verse was on the field, Florida State gave up 4.0 yards per play, which would have been good for the best in the United States.
Yeah.
And that's against a pretty tough offensive schedule, right? You play LSU, you play, there's some teams on that schedule that could move the football. Iowa gave up 4.2 yards per play, and that was good for number 1 in the country there. So with Jared Verse on the field, FSU would have been first if it was just limited to that. When Verse left the field, when the game was within 17 points, Florida State gave up 6.4 yards per play. Now, this was before the Georgia game, by the way. So this does not include that debacle. Yeah. Before the Georgia game, Florida State with Jared Verse off the field was 114th in the country in yards per play. Okay? So you go from first to 114th with one guy different. Okay?
One big-time guy, for sure.
Now, Verse is irreplaceable in terms of what you got from him as an elite player. That none of the guys that they brought in are going to be Jared Verse. Not year one, certainly. But the big difference was when Verse was on the field, they were able to hold up in the box on a regular basis because he was so physical against the run, and they asked him to two-gap a lot. They had him do what's called jimmying on the outside a lot, where you take that inside arm and you long arm it a little bit. You keep your outside arm clear, and he's got contained responsibilities against the run with that outside arm, and then if it's a pass, it turns into a pass rush there. And then if they decide to B-gap run it inside that, he's got to shed and take that B-gap run as well. So he's got both gaps, and then essentially you have a secondary player from the safety position who's coming up in secondary run support there if that end can't hold up. Well, if you've got an end like Jared Verse, you can do that and not give anything up, right? And every so often you'll give up a run for 8 or 10 yards and he'll be tackled by the safety. If you've got a guy who can't hold up against the run on the outside and can't do that, now you're a gap short. And now you're going to have to start bringing that safety down into the box. Now you're going to have to start playing all sorts of games. You open stuff up in the passing game. Teams are able to run the football. And when you watch the Georgia game, Florida State could not hold up on the edge at all. Georgia, basically, all they did is block down on the edge, took out the end players, and they actually drove the edge players back into the backers multiple times, and people were complaining about the backers' level of play in that game. It wasn't their fault. They had guys in their lap.
Yeah, we try to block that one out. They definitely didn't have the pieces out there to compete in that game. That's for sure.
So what they knew is they needed to go out and get edge players that could first and foremost hold up against the run, especially on first and second down in those light boxes. And what did they do? They went and they got a 275-pound defensive end who was second-team All-Pac-12 in Lolohea, and they got a 280-pound who they're going to slim down to about 270 also in Duro Jaye, who each of those guys are a problem in terms of stopping the run. They're a problem for offenses. And now you feel like you can put some size out there and hold up against the run. And then you've got Marvin Jones as a guy who can kind of do both. Yeah. So it was really, really imperative that they get to where they had 4 edges that they could trust to hold up against the run physically, and then at least 2 guys that could rush the passer. And now they've got that with Marvin Jones and Patrick Payton as guys that, have proven they can bend the edge. And then Duro Jaye and Lolohea, who if nothing else, are going to hold up against the run. That's why that was so important for them moving into next year. They had to have that depth to be able to hold up, or you'd just see teams over and over and over again do what Georgia did. Even without Georgia's talent, teams were going to be able to do that if they didn't add serious talent on the edge.
There is no doubt. And I guess before we move on to the ACC stuff, we got to talk linebacker. It's been mixed reviews. And look, I agree to the people that have the take of we should have, or we need to bring in a linebacker with experience. Look, I agree. I just think it's one of those and things. I don't think there was ever an or that popped into the equation. I think getting a guy like Sean Murphy has been kind of my issue with Randy, has been like, I see what you can do with a 3-star with this and that. I see what you can do with your guy that fits your mold, and you can take this guy and make him great. But let me just see what happens when you get a 5-star that fits your mold and you build him up. So that's kind of my thing. I think he's kind of elite clay. I think the word from around Alabama, even though he doesn't have a bunch of experience on the field yet, was that, he was a good player. So even if it may not be this year, I don't expect him to start this year, but I'm excited about getting the guy in. And I'm also expecting them to at least sign one more guy once May 1st gets here. Either that or, a grad transfer obviously could come at any point in time. But
Yeah, I mean, Murphy's an interesting prospect. He's got, some good short area quickness, which is really the thing that Randy likes most in backers. And it's one of the reasons why Randy tends to differ with the services in terms of where he has linebackers on his board versus where the services have backers on theirs. Is the various recruiting services tend to gravitate towards guys with a little bit better long speed and guys that look like they're, that they can cover. They're basically big guys that look like they have the feet to cover in space and really run, like long speed. Randy's less interested in that. I mean, Justin Cryer in a lot of ways is sort of your prototypical Randy backer.
Yeah.
Because what he's looking for is a guy that triggers fast and is quick in a phone booth, is really short area quick. And especially with the way that they play the light boxes and use their nickel and their safety so much in coverage, they feel like just having guys that can do that in the run game is really where they're going to get the most out of their backers. Murphy is an interesting fit there because I think he's more of a guy that showed, he's got good quick trigger in his high school stuff, and he showed some of that at Bama, but he's a little bit more long speed and a little bit linear as a player. So it'll be interesting to see how he transitions to what they're asking him to do. But yeah, I think he's going to be an interesting player there. To me, the guy that, aside from the edges, the guy that was the most important pickup for them, and I think you could basically say they needed DJ Uiagalelei, and then they needed those edge guys. And then I think the next most important guy they landed was actually Earl Little, because I think even though they had players at that spot, you return Greedy Vance and Kevin Knowles and even Edwin Joseph in the mix there that can play that star, that nickel position.
Little's got that toughness. He's got that different level of toughness.
Well, I think Little is much more prototypical for what Florida State wants at that nickel spot. And is very similar in terms of physical traits and other things to what they got out of Jerry Jones last year. And Jones was the best nickel in the country last year.
Killed it.
And I thought there was going to be a significant drop-off from him coming into this year. The addition of Little means that you're not certain that there's going to be a huge drop-off between Jones and Little, Jones and whoever is going to be at that nickel spot this year. And I think Little's going to end up being that guy. And, so many teams put their best cover or their best receiver really at that slot position.
Yeah.
Because it's so hard to cover, and you've got to have a guy that can hold up there and not give easy access. And I think Little ends up being really, really important for what they're trying to do next year.
Could not agree more. We're about 42 minutes in here, guys. We appreciate everybody that's in here. Just so you know, memberships are available. After this show, we are doing a members-only show in a little bit at 7:30 Eastern tonight with Freddie Stevenson. You have to be a member to check out that live stream. Besides that, it'll get released in videos and stuff like that later on. But we really appreciate everybody here. Make sure you go and check out the Unconquered podcast. Where exactly can people go to find that?
I mean, it's everywhere. I mean, it's
all
on
platforms.
YouTube. I'm going to start doing some live shows as well, which, I did back in 2017, 2018, back, before a lot of things changed. But I'm going to get back to doing some live shows as well and doing more film breakdowns as well. But I mean, it's on YouTube. Of course, got Patreon. I'm very grateful for all the folks that have supported over the years there. And then, wherever you get your podcasts. And, I have a little bit of a Twitter addiction that I'm going to have to break again this off season. So
we're all working on it, man.
I'll be on and off. I guess it's not Twitter anymore. I'll be on and off the X. So, I'm not hard to find.
You heard it here first. John D with a $4.99 super chat says, "Enjoy your show. Thanks for highlighting so much of FSU media. Jason is the man. Most in-depth and accurate FSU assessments and predictions." So we appreciate you, John D, and I could not agree more. But moving on, one thing that people just love to talk about, and we recently had a board of trustees meeting to move forward with, I believe, the topic of that was funding. And pretty much let's get this thing together. We're not playing around. We're looking to get the money to make a settlement or go to trial or whatever the case may be. I'll let Jen start off with this one. This is kind of like her more of area of expertise here. What's going on, Jen? They're ready to. I think they called their bluff or what.
Well, one, we have Jason Staples, who knows everything that goes on in North Carolina, right?
I know you love
So,
that part. When he said he had a lawyer, I'm thinking probably in North Carolina or lawyers. So we might have
It's
yes.
actually not the main
Okay.
North Carolina lawyer. The main North Carolina lawyer that I would have contacted on this, that I actually did text shortly after this all hit, texted me back saying, "Oh yeah, so you saw the filing that my office put out on the ACC's behalf?" It's like, "Oh yeah, I forgot you were with
Yeah.
that firm." So he's one of the guys who's
Wow.
on the ACC.
What the-
He's part of the team for the ACC side. So obviously
Oh,
he and
man.
I have had no discourse about this, because
Yeah.
that's it was just a
That's
very
a
quick like,
no.
oh yeah, I forgot.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be conflict of interest for you to talk about this outside of your own filings. So hope you lose.
Back.
Well,
So yeah.
I think the big news. I think most people think it was the board of trustees meeting yesterday. I know I accidentally said bank of trust, but that's really technically what it was. But the the I think the bigger news was North Carolina's ruling yesterday. I think that was the bigger news yesterday, which was basically saying that North Carolina cannot change conferences unless NC State either comes with them or has an equal landing spot to go. And so they actually gave it to the state legislature to either approve or deny North Carolina to be able to do that. So, like, Jason, what do you think about that? Like, I mean, we kind of knew that that's the way it was going to go, right? I didn't see. I really, well, maybe I didn't see them giving themselves the ability to void any sort of conference realignment for North Carolina, but I don't know. You tell me. I guess I'm maybe not surprised, but then I am.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see how that actually pans out, because that is basically ensuring that UNC can't just up and go on their own without higher approval. But all it really does in terms of how it actually is worded is it's going to require that North Carolina give a really good reason before
Yeah.
they go to get approved.
And who gets to
And
decide what the reason is? Like,
right,
like,
and that's one of those things where some of the folks from the North Carolina side were like, "How about 30 or 40 extra $1 million a year towards the state system?" That seems like a pretty good reason.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I mean, it seemed, yeah.
So I'm to some degree a little skeptical about how much of a barrier in the long run that's actually going to be. If Florida State is able to make it out of the conference, and I think based on my reading of the cases and the people that I've talked to, who are not involved on the ACC side, obviously can't get anything from that side, but from the people that I've talked to on this and my own reading of that, I do think it's pretty evident that there is going to be a divorce at some point from Florida State, that they will reach some sort of agreement or find a way ultimately beyond that to get a palatable exit. And once they do that, North Carolina is in a position where they're sort of eagerly waiting to see how that all works. And if it works for Florida State, then they may well follow, and they would like to follow. It's just a matter of timing, and it's a matter of being able to demonstrate that they could get an equally or better argument, an equal or better settlement from what Florida State got. If they get that, there's gonna be a lot of battles from the NC State side that basically are saying like, look, you can't just leave us in the lurch and leave us in the junior leagues to go do this. But ultimately, my experience as I've gotten into my 40s, money tends to win out.
Mm-hmm.
When there's a whole lot of money involved and when there's massive incentives in play for people to make a lot more money, stuff usually kind of works its way out to make room for more money. So I've got my I'm pretty skeptical about how much of a barrier that's actually going to be in the long run.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but I think that North Carolina being wanted by both the SEC and the Big Ten puts them in an interesting position. Because to me, I think that North Carolina would fit into the Big Ten perfectly. I think they would fit in perfectly. I think that would be a great situation for them. But hearing around North Carolina that their chancellor and everything is more SEC. So could you see a situation where the SEC invited North Carolina and they took NC State with them just so that the SEC would then have North Carolina? Because I could see the SEC doing that.
I doubt the SEC would take both of them. I think
You don't
that's
think
very.
so?
I think
Okay.
that's very unlikely. But I do know that there's a very significant preference for the SEC within North Carolina circles, not
Yeah.
just at the chancellor level. I mean, they're changing chancellors right now anyway.
Yeah.
So,
But
but
it's
not
like the
just there, but
president, the AD too, right?
well,
I mean,
the
it's
president is a system president, so it's a little different. So North
mm,
Carolina is in a different kind of arrangement in terms of
right.
organizational structure than a place like Florida State or the Florida State system. North Carolina is a flagship system where they have like all of the state institutions are under one system-wide president
Right.
and
Oh wow.
under one board of governors that is over all of the state universities in the state of North Carolina, whether that's UNC Charlotte, North Carolina, uh, NC State, all of the Wilmington, all of those are under one president. And then every campus, every individual university has its chancellor and board of trustees that handles their more local stuff. So it's a more complicated thing. And then North Carolina is basically, UNC is basically the flagship of that program, whereas Florida does not have a flagship school. And each individual institution has its own president, which is a different arrangement. Florida has its top tier of three, and
Yeah.
the whole thing there. But there's still a lot of rivalry within the system in North Carolina, much like there is
Yeah.
in Florida, where NC State and North Carolina they have different contingents on that have their own things that go back and forth. But at any rate, the big thing for North Carolina is that the major boosters, the the majority of the decision makers in the athletic department and just in general within the institution are going to prefer the SEC. They
Yeah.
just they prefer the SEC. There are some people on the academic side of the shop that would prefer the Big Ten, which is not surprising, but ultimately they know that the SEC would take them, and I'm pretty certain that if when that day comes, North Carolina will go to the SEC. It's
Yeah.
just a matter of when, essentially. I
And
don't
I
see.
and I agree with you on that. I really do. I agree that I think North Carolina leans more towards the SEC, even though I think they'd be a perfect fit in something like the Big Ten. I just I was kind of wondering if the SEC would then, go ahead and take NC State to just unburden North Carolina, and then they would be done. They wouldn't have
No,
to
I
take
don't.
anybody
I don't.
else.
I don't think that's plausible because the SEC is not interested. So the SEC knows that if they wait 10 more years, they're going to get UNC.
Yep.
Yeah. Once the
Right. So from the
ACC's gone.
SEC side, from the SEC side, there's no hurry. Right? They have
Yeah.
no worries as far as that goes. If they just wait 10 years, which is not that long from their perspective, then they get North Carolina at a discount, and then they can go to then NC State can go wherever they want, and that's that. And they're not going to take another program just to get one program at this stage. They
Right.
want who they want, and they're not going to take somebody else that doesn't give them additional dollars. The real question is whether NC State would actually be a target for the Big Ten in that environment. If North Carolina wound up in the ACC, would NC State, which is an AAU institution, is a fairly football crazed. They're actually the more football crazed school in
Yeah.
North Carolina compared to North
100%.
Carolina
Yeah.
compared to UNC.
I think you'd have a similar
Would
situation to what you're saying, to where the Big Ten would, like as a chain of events. I don't think they would go out and get them, but like you said, if UNC goes to the SEC, yeah, why not grab that? That seaboard right there with North Carolina State.
there would be a reason for North Carolina or for North Carolina State to go to the Big Ten in that case,
Right.
just for the essentially the footprint in the North Carolina region. The real question at that point, though, and a lot of this boils down to what's gonna result from this fight over the grant of rights from Florida State's side is, in 3 years, if Florida State's able to crack open this grant of rights, I think 3 to 4 years from now, we're looking at a completely reconfigured landscape that's beyond just Big Ten and SEC. We're talking about a different division that is probably more collectively bargained in terms of how the players are being handled, and transfers are essentially prevented by conferences or by contracts, and things kind of shake themselves out a little bit differently. What does that look like? And I don't know the answer to that question, because a lot of that is going to be kind of figured out by the institutions and negotiations from people who have a lot of dollars at stake. But do we really think that, for example, Northwestern or Rutgers are going to have a long-term home in the highest division, and a couple of the major programs that are in the SEC or that are in the ACC? So let's say an NC
Relegation.
State or
Bring it
some
on.
of those programs are
All
not
for it.
going to find their way into that kind of division. I find that the programs that are going to want to pay that kind of money and that have value in terms of strong fan bases and draw eyes will find their way into that sort of upper division. And the ones that are not interested in playing that game, I mean, your Wake Forests, your Boston Colleges, and others are not going to make it there.
That's
So
the issue.
how
That's
that
the
all
issue,
shakes
Doc.
out, I don't know. But I think essentially a lot of the college sports landscape right now is watching very carefully what's happening with the grant of rights situation, because this not only has impact on which programs are wedded to which conferences and basically can't leave those conferences, but whether the conferences could actually leave some of these programs behind. That does the SEC really want Vanderbilt in the long haul? Right? I mean,
No.
what's going to happen with some of these other legacy situations in 5-6 years? We really don't know. And I think a lot of what's happening right now in the legal battle is going to have a lot to say about that. And so there's a lot undetermined there.
Yeah. And bringing back to where we are right now, it's right now, it's like the 26th, I believe, of January. We have February 16th is when, both the cases, North Carolina and Florida, have to have their first kind of answer to it. And the bot meeting, like all the talk around it has been that it was about financing. I think Florida State is to the point. The ACC has pushed Florida State to the point over the decades. Like, it doesn't matter like what, like they want to get as small of a settlement as possible. I just feel like no matter what the dollar amount, I feel like that's a lot of what this meeting had to do. I think they'll be able to go out in a traditional financing sense. It's to the point now, like you said, with the giant 30, 40, $50 million gap. Like what financial institution isn't going to be willing to loan the money when they see, oh, you're going to be making what back every year when you get to the Big Ten, 100 million? Oh, instead of 30, 35, 40. Okay. It's like, I mean, even if you can only make $10 million, say, of payments a year, I mean, whatever, I'm not a giant finance guy, but if you could make $10 million payment on whatever the case may be and the different ways they have to work it, I feel like that's kind of the essence of what's going on right now. They're gearing up for war. And I don't think Florida State's going to take any answer besides getting out of the ACC like hell or high water.
No, I think all parties at this point are aware of that. It's just a matter of how much it's going to be. And Florida State, from all accounts, really believes that they have a winning case. So, and I think arguably the biggest part of this is their argument that the ACC commissioner violated the charter essentially by unilaterally extending the ESPN window to greenlight the extension to the contract. So if that's the case, if the ACC actually through their own negligence invalidated the agreements here, then Florida State's free. That's basically their case. And they think there's other cases in play as well in terms of all of this. I mean, the question of whether or not a grant of rights is liquidated damages should be understood as liquidated damages, and whether or not, if it liquidated damages, it needs to be, at least in the state of Florida. And there's actually, this is why venue matters a lot, is how Florida and North Carolina legislatures have handled damages in the past differ. In Florida, there's a clear precedent that you have to have, that any liquidated damages need to actually map onto real world damages that you can demonstrate. Whereas in North Carolina, it's not quite so clear. So if this is litigated out in Florida, the way that Florida State wants, then, if they can demonstrate, if they can basically convince that the grant of rights should be understood as liquidated damages, then essentially it would basically invalidate the huge cost, because that it's implausible that you're dealing with that amount of damages over that amount of time. So, they feel like they've got some winning arguments here. And so they're willing to stick it out longer and fight harder and see what the ACC's pain point is in order to get a reduced settlement. They're probably going to stretch this longer than you might have initially thought, because they think they've got a strong case. Whereas the ACC's case is basically like, you signed this contract. Guys, like, you only stopped thinking that this was okay when, when other situations clearly became better than yours, but, that's actually not cause for breach of contract. Regretting that you signed a bad deal is not actually legal cause for breaking contract. So you therefore owe what the contract says. That's a pretty big gap between those two. Where that comes down to is, Florida State will ultimately get out. It's just a matter of who is able to convince enough. And, if this starts to get close to litigation, which side actually believes, and, you have to have on your legal team, you have to have people who are able to say, okay, here's how this is likely to play out from this perspective. Here's how this, and, basically assess the probability of winning. And once you've weighed that out, then you start to determine, like, well, what's our number to not have the chance of losing? And that's how this stuff gets settled. And it's just a matter of getting to that point. And I think we're still a good ways out. I don't think this is going to settle anytime soon, because I think both sides are pretty convinced that they have a good case.
Yeah, somebody made a good point. They said ESPN could fix this right away if they wanted to, yada yada. My thing is, just to point out to the audience, I know we talked about this a lot. In North Carolina, if this thing goes to court, there's a chance that, like, Florida State could sue and end up, getting a half settlement or a third or a quarter. In Florida, if it went to court and went to a judgment, it would basically be all or nothing. Either they're going to pay it or they're out scot-free kind of thing. So I feel like if we can get our way and get it in Florida, I think you have a chance to see that settlement quickly. North Carolina, you have a better chance of it going to discovery. But and we've talked about this a ton. I'm sure you've talked about it a ton. I feel like within all that Raycom and the people we had leading our organization and where they ended up in conflict of interests, I just don't feel like the ACC is ever going to get discovery. We'll see. I could be proven wrong, but I guess it depends on the 16th, how quick they fast track this thing, if they're going to be able to postpone it without having discovery for another couple months. I think that's going to be and like I said, me and Jen have talked about it a lot, but I think that's going to be the difference. And you talked about signing the contract, and I agree with everything you said from both sides, kind of looking at it. I think another big sticking point, obviously, is that 9 to 10 years where ESPN hasn't even guaranteed that. So it's kind of like, where was ESPN making an empty promise? Did they even have the right? There's a whole ultimatum in there where they basically said, look, ESPN said this, so they're dropping your butt. If you don't sign it now, it's like, man, having Wilcox and different guys in charge, it's a mess. If we could get that discovery, it would be amazing, though.
Some of that may not be as important as a lot of folks think, partly because of when you're talking about the Raycom stuff and all of that, most of that goes back to like 2011 and 2012, and the statute of limitations for damages of this nature may rule that out. Now,
Well,
if you can make a
2016,
case,
not to interrupt you, but the stuff with the 20 from 2027 to 30 to 36,
yeah,
there was
but
like
that's a whole
supposedly an
different.
ultimatum in 2016. Is what I
No,
was
that's
talking about.
absolutely
Yeah.
right. No, that would still apply, but the Raycom angle of those things actually came, back in 2011.
Well, that was
And
still
you can
Raycom that had the ACC digital network. Like that was still all. Sorry, but
that's the argument that essentially you have to make, is that this
right.
ends up being relevant here. But basically the statute of limitations, I believe, it's either 3 or 4 years for that.
Oof,
So
that would be
you have
tough.
to you have to demonstrate that damages materialized at some point within the last 3 years or 4 years.
Yeah.
I can't remember exactly how that works. So I don't remember the exact number, but you have to demonstrate that damages emerged in that window in order for that
Right.
to apply. So, and then if you can demonstrate that damages emerged there, then maybe you can get back to some of the causes for that and try to get to that. But I'm not sure that that's actually where this case is gonna turn. And Allison is right. The 16th is just a filing deadline for answer to the other's lawsuit. So
Yep.
it's not really a matter of anything significant coming out of that. It's just going to be a matter of you're going to basically start to see what the answers, what the basic outline in terms of the answers to the other party's arguments are going to be. So what counter arguments does FSU make to the ACC and vice versa in their legal briefs? That's basically all you find out by the 16th. And you're going to get much further along before you get to anything in terms of discovery or anything like that. But yeah, the question about the ultimatum and all of that, I mean, a lot of that has to do with issues of consideration in terms of, the grant of rights contracts. Ultimately, you have to have somebody who is responsible and somebody who might be damaged. And, the question is, in a contract where the party that breaks the contract doesn't actually damage the other party, then having any sort of liquidated damages clause may be invalid, because that party does not actually have consideration in terms of them being affected by the contract in a legal sense. So, the consideration of the grant of rights is by language in the grant of rights tied explicitly to ESPN. So it's third party consideration. And this has been one of the sticking points for some questions within the legal community for the last few years of whether or not a grant of rights is actually something that will hold up, because third party consideration can get a little sticky. So that is something that, with the question of how that got negotiated out, the ESPN consideration being the consideration for the grant of rights versus the ACC actually being the party that would be damaged. These are things that'll have to get litigated out and decided by a judge, and it gets really complicated really quickly.
No doubt. And people a lot smarter than me, and I can tell you've got a better handle on it than I do. But we've had Doug Rohan on here, we've had Danielle Kelly, and we're just slowly but surely learning. And we brought up the North Carolina thing because me and Jen have both been talking about possibly getting one of those people on here to hear that side of it, just the differences, because we've heard all about the Sunshine Law and stuff like that. But Jen, did you have anything on this subject before we move on?
No,
we're getting close to opening up the phone lines. We're at 1 hour and 10 minutes here.
the only thing I was going to say is the Raycom stuff, I guess, could come into play if the statute of limitations is 3 years, if something was still going on with that, like if Swafford was still employed by the ACC, if that whole whatever went down was still being covered up or looked at or still
it's a
being
4 year it's a 4 year statute. I'm looking
it's
at
a
it
four.
now. So the
it would
statute
have
of limitations for breach of fiduciary duty is what it is, and it's a statute of
Yeah.
limitations in Florida for breach of fiduciary duty, which is one of the things that Florida State's challenging here, is 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting.
So
I
that
think
would mean
you're the
that
first person that's brought that up, and that's
they would have
one of the main points.
what Florida State would have to then do is say, I have proof that this has continued, or this type of breach is still going on. The cover up is still going on. The money is still not, like, it would have to still be going on for them to be able to break that statute of limitations. And that clearly probably isn't going on if, Swafford is no longer employed, and I don't know what's going on with Raycom. I'm guessing they're, I don't really know, but I'm just saying that it would have to continue to still be going on for them to be able to use that if that limitations is run out.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, like I said, it gets tricky because if you can demonstrate that damages emerged within the last 4 years from something, then you can, theoretically go back to to the reasons for that and argue that there were improper reasons for basically wrapping up a bad or writing a bad or illegal contract, something like that. But I don't think ultimately that's going to be the path out.
Right. I think the way they get out is that 2027 ESPN thing. I think you're going to pay the exit fee. I think then the grant of rights, I don't see them really wanting to open that up to bring out the North Carolinas, the Clemsons, and everybody else to get in there and get that. I just, I think that 2027 ESPN out gives Florida State maybe an out, and I think you're going to see a negotiated number on that.
Yeah, that's possible. It's possible. But again, that could go a couple different ways depending on how that's argued out. And there are a lot of different angles here because Florida State made basically six individual arguments that if they hit on any one of them could potentially be enough. To some degree it's throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what will stick. And I mean, that's legal practice. And the ACC basically has one really, potentially strong argument, which is, guys, you signed this contract and didn't seem all that, if I'm, reading your trustees and your president and your AD's comments on these things, you seem pretty happy with it when you signed it, back in that day. So, now just because you have buyer's remorse, you want to give it back and, sorry, but, you can't return this.
They would like for that to go over
for so long. So that's their one argument.
They would love it. They would love for that to go over. It's just, you're absolutely right. That's their they're going to stick to that, and that's what they're going to go to for sure.
So, that you can see why the ACC would feel that they have a winning argument here. Now, again, you've got six potential arguments, and I think a couple of them have some real teeth to them that Florida State has made. And it's just a matter of seeing how that all develops and what the answers look like and all of that. It's going to be pretty interesting to follow.
The question is, does the ACC and ESPN and all that truly believe that they have their I's dotted and their T's crossed? Because they do have that argument. But if discovery comes, was there actually this call and that text message and that email and, hey, we're going to BS them here. So yeah, this is going to be just the gift that keeps on giving. I have a feeling we're going to be talking about this a whole lot until this thing gets settled. It's going to be a lot of fun. I think February 16th, the biggest thing we can learn is, I guess, the next deadline the judge puts out in each case. And I'm not sure if they're exactly combining them or if it's Florida State's flying to North Carolina and the ACC's flying down to Florida, exactly how that works. But I guess maybe we could find something out like that shortly thereafter, February 16th.
Yeah, so I see somebody referencing Hobson Choice.
Thanks, Amelia Islandol. I'm sorry, you gifted 5 memberships. We appreciate you so much. Sorry.
I did see somebody in the chat mention Hobson Choice, as a potential argument against the ACC. I don't really think that is necessarily applicable in this case. It'd be hard to argue from Florida State's side, at least on my assessment of that. And, others may have a little bit more. Others who are full Esquires may have a little bit more to say on that, but I'm skeptical there. Partly because we're dealing with commercial law, where you have multiple parties that are informed with different options, as opposed to usually Hobson Choice is going to have to do with private transactions that are not in commercial spaces. It's not always the case, but I suspect that won't be that won't be Florida State's trump card there. But the thing that does persuade me that there may be some sloppiness and not all the I's maybe dotted or T's crossed on the ACC side is that there were some mistakes in the grant of rights. One in particular.
They don't want nobody to read that thing, do they, Talk?
Well, I mean, it's the biggest thing is that it was shocking to me that the grant of rights did not explicitly state venue for where that would be litigated, and that actually is pretty shocking to me. I mean, that's pretty standard in any kind of agreement like that you state preferred venue. Now, I think from the ACC side, the argument on that might be that, well, there's a clause in there that you cannot sue to negate the grant of rights. So if there's, if you've waived your ability to sue, then there can't be a place where, if this is contested, there would be venue, and that it would be, potentially, that even including venue would indicate that clause is not actually valid. I don't find that persuasive. I think it was a mistake, and that they just did not say, if this is, if you happen to breach this contract and challenge this agreement that you've signed, then here's where this is going to be done, and it's going to be done according to this law. And that is just absolutely standard. It was not done with the ACC's grant of rights, which, makes me wonder what other mistakes might be laying under the hood in terms of some of these things. And, even very good law firms sometimes make mistakes. And I do wonder what may be there.
Certainly begs the question. Guys, we have got, let's see, it's 6:51. We've got about another 25 minutes we can go here. We usually open the lines up after the hour. If you're down to take a few questions, we'll open it up and see if anybody has anything. And of course, Jen, if you have anything, if you want to, any questions you got, we can go to pretty much anywhere now. We've got through most of the stuff.
Well, let me know, what are your thoughts on Mike Norvell and the possibility of that he was being talked to by Alabama, because you hear different people, right? That would have been interesting, I guess.
Every indication that I've gotten, and from people who I'll just say from people who would know, is that Norvell had it was a very realistic situation where Norvell could have chosen to go elsewhere.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
He
that
made his choice.
That would have been interesting. Oh, gosh.
He made his choice, and he asked for some specific things in terms of support, because Norvell's basic contention is he wants to be at Florida State, but he wants to be at Florida State so long as he can actually win at Florida State like he would at any of these other blue blood programs. He doesn't want to be at Florida State if he can't actually compete for a title. Yeah. Right? If he can't compete at the level that he knows he can as a coach, then Florida State becomes a significantly less attractive job for him. But he's one of the best coaches in America, and he knows it. And he thinks, given the support that he's now had committed in certain respects, he thinks that he's in a place where he can win it all. And, that was the thing that really mattered to him.
How did you feel? I just kind of wanted to know. I don't know that I even listened to your full thoughts on them being snubbed. How did you feel when that went down? Were you surprised, or did you expect it to come?
I was surprised. Just a combination of precedent, looking at what they'd done with prior teams and some teams that were undefeated, or one-loss teams from Power 5 conferences that got the benefit of the doubt in the past, and watching how dominant Florida State's defense was against Louisville, which was a very good Louisville offense. I mean, that was a top 20 offense by the best metrics going into that game. Looking at how dominant that defense was, I thought it was pretty apparent that was a team that could compete with anybody, just because it'd be difficult to score on them. I had some concerns because, it was not major concerns. I was pretty convinced that they were going to be in, that the committee would basically take the easy road and, just go 1, 2, 3 undefeated teams. Texas beat Alabama. There you go. And oh well, the SEC got left out, and now we'll have the chaos. We'll have the controversy about that, but that's good for the sport, etc. I didn't think that they'd do what they did, in that respect. But my concern, as I was watching the ACC title game, was the degree to which Joe Tessitore's call was, so consistently beating the drum about, is this, wow, look at this Florida State team, and they're out here, and is this Florida State team, do they have enough on offense to be able to be in?
That's a great impression, bro.
Do they have enough on offense to be included in the playoff over an Alabama or a Texas, teams that have their starting quarterback? And you're looking here, and that they're really struggling to grind out these yards, against a Louisville team that lost to Kentucky last week. And, this was just, it was 3.5 hours of, I don't know. I mean, this team, I'm just not sure they've put enough together to convince the committee. And what had me concerned was that I knew that the college football playoff committee was watching the same feed I was.
Yeah.
So they were listening to Joe Tessitore for 3.5 hours do a commercial on, I don't know, I just know, has Florida State put together a convincing enough performance in this one to demonstrate that they should go in over an Alabama? And, ultimately, I actually think that had a significant impact, because if you're watching that and hearing that for 3.5 hours, and you're not paying very, very close attention to what's going on the other side of the ball, if Tessitore had done it the other way, if he'd called it this way of unbelievable defensive performance from this Florida State team, this is the second time in 2 weeks that they've given up negative yards in the fourth quarter, and that hasn't been done in 2 decades. Look at the way that this defense has stood up quarter after quarter, and just, if he'd laid it on thick about how good that defense was all game, and how, this really good Louisville offense had done nothing, and they continue to just run into the wall, and look at Jared Verse and what he's doing here. If he'd laid that on for 3.5 hours, I do wonder what the result of that would have been. But I continue to think that there were people on the broadcast and big money side of this that had a strong interest in who they wanted in the playoff, and certain people had, that certain people ultimately made those arguments in the way that they did, and those arguments have weight in terms of how the committee decides to discuss things. So I don't think it's true that ESPN, walked in the door, or that some representative from ESPN walked in the door or texted the various members of the committee to say, here's who we want. I think just after 2 or 3 weeks of, I don't know, and then 3 hours of a conference title game where they're just told, I don't know. Yeah. I think ultimately a lot that put enough question in the minds of the committee that they made the decision that they did. And I think the committee was shocked by how, the response of not just of Florida State fans, but people across the country not involved with Florida State, who just went, wait, what? Because I think they had gotten so convinced by that rhetoric.
They lived in a bubble. Yeah.
And they're in that bubble. So you asked how I felt about it. Look, I bled and sweat as a bad football player at the college level. I was not a good player, but I poured everything I had into it. And I know what that work feels like. I know what it looks like. I know how hard that team worked to get to where they were. Mm-hmm. I know very few people actually really know how banged up this Florida State team was over the course of the year. And, how many guys were playing through injury over the course of the season, especially second half of the season, where they were gutting it out. and to gut it out and to ultimately do what they did to be able to get to where they got, and then basically to have it taken away from them, not because of anything they did. I was devastated for them. For me, this doesn't impact my life, right? I'm not on that team. My children are still healthy. You know, it doesn't change how much money I make, which isn't very much. It does, you know, in terms of the actual quality of my life in all those respects, it didn't matter. You know, it's not something that hurts me. But man, I will say, I today am still, like, there's still a little bit of a weight. I am devastated for those players and those coaches who, for the rest of their life, will have a hole in their soul because of what happened there, and because they didn't have the opportunity to compete for something that they believed, and I think they had a good case, that they had a chance to win, and that they had something taken away from them. And, you know, that was sort of how I felt. It was just like, I could not conceptualize that a committee with coaches on it, who knew how hard it is to go undefeated, who knew how hard it is and how much work you have to put in. The difference between going 12-0 and 11-1 in college football is enormous.
Oh yeah.
Because of the focus and the degree of grit that it takes to battle at that level every week. Whereas if you have that one hiccup, and then, you know, you kind of get yourself right and come back the next week, you can get better.
It's harder
if you just
every
keep
week.
hanging on and just hanging on and hanging on, it says something about something else. And it's just, that part was really the part that really made me sad, is I knew that those guys had come back. Many of those guys had come back after having a chance to go to the NFL. They'd, you know, come in, bought in fully in order to do that, and then had it taken away from them. And I feel terrible for them. And honestly, I would have felt the same way about this if it had been Miami, or if it had been Florida, or if it had been any other team in college football. Knowing what I know, as, you know, from my, you know, limited experience in this respect, I would feel the same way, that a significant injustice was done, that group deserved better than that. And that, you know, that it communicated something bad also, just about how the world works. You know, sports are supposed to be a meritocracy. They really, I mean, it's a business. I get that. But, you know, you tell guys, you work hard, you win, the scoreboard ultimately is what matters. You know, let your play do the talking. And it turned out that play is not actually what mattered. And that to me was just awful.
What evidence was there for it? Like, literally, when you look at the championships the past 10 years, it's like 5 SEC, 3 ACC, 1 Big Ten. You know, Florida State got 1, Clemson got 2. So it's like, what has the ACC shown? Like, it really comes down to marketing. That's always been my biggest contention. The SEC decided between 04 and 08, we're never going to let this shit happen again. They went marketing through the roof. Big Ten did the same. The Pac-12 didn't. They're dead. Big 12 on its way out, and the ACC's maybe been the worst out of all of them. And it's like, this propaganda has spread to such a level. Like, don't get me wrong, is the SEC the best conference there's been in the past 20 years? Sure. Is the Big Ten maybe second? There's an argument, but is the ACC 4th or 5th? Like, is just made out year in and year out?
Well,
it's like the stats don't bear it out.
Any gap between the conferences this year was minimal as it was.
Minuscule.
You know, ultimately, the ACC didn't get the benefit of the doubt this year, partly because Clemson had 4 losses.
Yeah.
So if Clemson had been a one-loss team and had been no different in terms of the actual quality of the team, because they had how many 1-score losses?
Mm-hmm.
You know, they lost to Miami in overtime. They lost big to Duke in that first game.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, fumbled away 4 games. I mean, the Florida State game they fumbled away. They fumbled away 4 games. You know, the metrics show that
beat the
Clemson
crap out of
team
Notre Dame, who was Ohio State's best win.
Yeah. The metrics show that Clemson team on a success rate level was a top 10 team. But because of the 4 losses and ultimately the various brands at the top of the ACC standings weren't, big brand teams, the ACC didn't get any benefit of the doubt there. And that affected Florida State. As did the fact that LSU had so many injuries on their defense that they ultimately were, that they had a couple extra losses in SEC play that diminished that game. And especially since it had been the first game of the year, people kind of forgot about it. So, all of that kind of conspired in terms of how Florida State was seen on this. But to me, you look at the evidence of that, the thing that really grated me as much as anything is if you look at how the Washington and Michigan teams were talked about in the playoff. It was all about like, man, the team, they went through adversity, and this Washington team has just fought and clawed. No matter what, they played so many close games. And, I'm doing Tessitore again because he talked about this. They played so many close games, and they didn't have a win by more than 10 points since the beginning of October, but this team was just so committed and the culture was so good that they just kept finding a way to win. And ultimately that's what it's about. And I'm sitting here going, really? That's what it's about now?
Yep.
Like you're going to say that? That's the insult to injury part that
just talking about Florida State the whole time. That's what hurts about it so bad.
It's their player gets injured and they're like, oh my God, look at them coming back. Their star player gets injured. We're watching this coach come back and this team, all they do is win. And I'm sitting here. I just bought my new TV in the toy room and I wanted to just throw stuff at it and I couldn't because I didn't buy the warranty on it. And
warranty won't cover the controller through the screen anyway.
No, it won't anyway. So, but I'm like, I'm not about to break this new TV, but I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I couldn't believe it out of Greg McElroy's mouth, out of all people.
Ooh,
yeah, it's just ultimately about the wins. I mean, so there's the McElroy. It's just, it's ultimately, this team just keeps finding a way to win.
Yep.
Yeah, all right.
Isn't that nice?
That's fine.
It's amazing. I did see another team that did that too and lost their absolute star player and still won games. Maybe not pretty, but winning is winning. At least that's what we've always been told. And
it's a one-off. It's like it can never even possibly happen again. It's just, why is it always Florida State? Is that narcissism? It sure feels like it's always us.
Even beyond all that, though, if you look at Washington, I think you should admire. I think we should all admire exactly that they managed to go from the beginning of October through the rest of the season without a win by more than 10 points. But the interesting thing there is, as much credit as you give them for that, Florida State was getting
dinged.
Was getting criticized and dinged for not winning by more, but the average margin of victory was 19.
Mm-hmm.
It's insane.
And you go, wait a second. Whoa. So they're winning by 6 and 7. They need an interception return for a touchdown in the fourth quarter to beat Arizona State. They beat a good Louisville team by 10 and cover, and it's not enough. Like, wait a second.
Back to Bama, that freaking Auburn game they played.
They cover at the Swamp, and it's not impressive enough. But I think a lot of this is because teams that have great defenses typically don't get the benefit of the doubt because everybody likes the high flying offense and all of that, and that's what I would think. Except Michigan
shutting that down at Louisville should have been a good thing. You shut down a high flying offense, which was Louisville, right? Louisville was a damn good offense. I don't know what anybody thinks. Michigan, on the other hand, had less yards than Brock Glenn. I don't know what anybody wants.
It's not about wins. It's about quality losses. It's all it's about. Quality losses. You got to have that quality loss.
I'm pretty sure
either that or be headed to the Big Ten.
It's about brand.
Yeah.
But I hear that, but it's like Florida State's brand shits on Washington. So I think it's about brand when it comes to the brand of the SEC and the Big Ten and the ESPN and stuff like that.
That's correct.
Yeah, for sure.
I think if Michael Penix
why we want to get over there.
I'm just telling you, George, if Michael Penix had been hurt, Washington would have been in the same situation Florida State was.
I'm not sure about that.
You don't think so?
I'm not sure about that.
It's just so unprecedented. It's
I
like
mean, part of the
Well,
reason that I
maybe
say
because
that,
they're going to the Big Ten, they wouldn't want to piss off the Big Ten. Maybe like I don't
if
know.
Oregon
it has-
State
it-
was
it has to-
undefeated, maybe.
yeah, it has to do with the perception that the Pac-12 was the best conference in the country or the deepest conference in the country.
And it dissolved. Like, how did that?
Right.
Like, where did
But-
that come from? Just because they play close games, that means they're the best. It's like it drives me berserk.
That's what
But-
the SEC
but-
gets away with every year.
But I mean, the reason that I think that it may not have worked the same way with Penix is, and you may be right. I mean, if Travis had not gotten hurt and Penix hadn't, then you're probably, and Penix had, then you're probably
that's
right.
true.
But you know, when 3-4 weeks before all of that went down, you already had discussions about Florida State being boxed out by Alabama and Texas. That communicates to me that Florida State was regarded as sort of the odd one out from the beginning, regardless of what is happening with Washington and Michigan, and that those teams, those programs are kind of immune from that. The question was always, can Florida State do enough to show that they should be in over in Alabama?
Yeah.
You know,
and it's
that's
like,
what that
and the
basically boils down
discussion
to.
the discussion should have always been between Alabama and Texas. That was where it should have always been had they gone with past precedents and everything else, right? I mean, that's the way it was supposed to go, and it just didn't go that way. I get it. No, I'm not over it, and no, I'm not going to get over it, and I'm not ever going to let those people forget it, because honestly, I've heard from people who are like diehard Tennessee fans. You know, I live in Memphis, so I deal with them a lot, and they basically said it ruined college football for them. Like it just ruined it. And I hear from like my family and they say, well, my God, I watch TV all the time. And they're like, well, those kids can now go play, you know, they'll be fine next year. And like, that's one of the biggest things is it's like, okay, well, in the 12-team playoff, you'll be fine. But those kids who work their ass off aren't on the team anymore.
What if they've got one loss and they should be, you know, it's always it's gonna move to the next thing.
Yeah. I've had that discussion with several people around up here because folks will, see a license plate holder or whatever and be like, oh man, Florida State got the shaft, but hey, they got they got a chance to run it back next year. And I look at them and I say, no, they don't.
Really?
Those guys are all gone.
Those
guys are all gone. It's a different team. Jared Verse is not going to be back next year. Jordan Travis is not going to be back next year. Johnny Wilson is not coming back. Keon Coleman is not coming through that door. You had an entire program that had geared toward 2023 as the year. They felt that was a roster that was a championship roster. They pushed the chips to the middle of the table. Felt like they added the piece that they needed to get over the hump with Keon Coleman. Because the whole time, I will tell you this. The whole time leading up to the 2023 season, in the offseason from January on in 2023, essentially Florida State was looking up the road at Georgia and saying, we need to add whatever pieces we need to get over the hump so that we can compete, we can beat that team if it comes to it in the playoff next year. So it was, and they were aware the 2022 team lost 3 games because of a lack of depth.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, when Fabian Lovett and Robert Cooper got hurt at defensive tackle, and then they got banged up on the offensive line, that cost them 3 games. And they knew it, so they went out and they shored up depth there, and they felt like they were one playmaker down. They felt like they needed one guy on the outside that was a one-on-one coverage eraser to be able to break a Georgia-type defense down where, okay, fine, we may not be able to run against them, but we're going to have 2 guys out there that nobody, including Georgia, is going to be able to cover one-on-one. So that's what they did. They balanced that out to try to get what they needed to be in the best position possible to win against the kind of team that they would be likely to play in the playoff. They did that for 2023. They put all of that together. If you look at the 2024 roster, I think it's harder to see that team as essentially having all the answers baked in at the same level.
It's like 2022 again. It's like
Right.
2022 again. You could see them
It's a-
building up to know what they need for 24 to make another run.
It's a deeper roster than 2022 was.
Right, but just
So
similar in
you've
that,
got-
like what you
yeah.
explained there.
You've got a higher floor. You're less likely to lose 3 straight games because of a lack of talent at one spot. But it's not, it does, I don't think the 2024 roster has quite the same level of elite difference maker on both sides of the ball that the 2023 roster did. You don't have a Keon Coleman. You don't have even a Johnny Wilson in terms of you're just matchup erasers. You don't have quite the big play threat at running back with Benson. There's just, as good as Marvin Jones might end up, or a couple of these other guys, there's no Jared Verse. There were some difference makers that were, play for a long time on Sunday type difference makers that they had on that 2023 roster. That those are the guys that differentiate you when you get into the matchups against the other best programs in the country. And they're going to have to figure out how to, compensate for the lack of those guys this next year. That's going to be the thing they've got to figure out.
Yeah, the body's there, the clay's there. Malik Benson could possibly become that, but yeah, I agree. I think this is the year you kind of find it out. And who knows? You never know. Teams come together to go on those special runs, but I agree with you 100%. That's kind of how I see it, how we've talked about it. Guys, we have got about 10 minutes left. So if you want to get a call in, speak now or however you hold your peace. I see James Coleman, man. You can call in and talk to us if you want. Anybody, if you got a question for me, Doc, or Jen before we get out here, we really appreciate it. Again, at 7:30, we have a members-only recording we're doing that's going on with Freddie Stevenson. So speak now if you ever hold your peace. You got about 10 more minutes with Mr. Staples to get those questions in. And if not, we're going to just keep on chatting it up. Okay. We haven't talked about high school recruiting at all. Is there anything there you want to touch on before we get out of here? I know we just had our signing day and stuff, but it's our contention 2025 is that year. Like the lines, like we're finally going to get those DNs we talked about. We hadn't had the guy. We've had to go out there and get him to the transfer portal. Really excited to see what we can do in this one. Like it seems like this staff recruits what's there, and they're just not going to they're not to the level like a Georgia. You can just get whatever you want, but it's like this year was wide receivers and DBs. It seems like next year O-line and D-line is going to be some big action there.
Yeah. I think it's going to be interesting because as long as Saban had stayed at Alabama,
yeah,
I think Florida State, the lack of of multiple big time closers in recruiting on the staff, and you'll hear about this from other folks who are more plugged into the recruiting scene than me. The absence of some of those Georgia's loaded with several guys. You got T-Rob and some of these guys that are just absolute. They have a reputation as dogs on the trail. They lock down guys, they get them to commit, and they find ways to get them to commit for less NIL money than they might be able to get elsewhere. And it's just sort of charisma, force of personality. Florida State does not have a staff comprised of a bunch of those guys. What Florida State does have is a staff of guys that know how to coach and are pretty good at developing the players that they have. Now, that's super valuable. That's really good. Oh, yeah. But when you're in a position where you've got a Saban up the road who, Alabama signed, it was, I think, 38 guys who were 5 stars from the state of Florida over Saban's career at Alabama. That's an awful lot of talent drain from your backyard that you really want to keep in state. So with Saban still at Alabama, I would have more concerns about where Florida State sort of is in the pecking order. And, I've got specific positions where I'm looking at it and I'm going, they really need to make sure that they hit better at that spot than they have.
It's almost like they knew when they signed those extensions that Saban was retiring, huh?
Well, it was known in the industry before Saban retired that he was likely to retire. I mean, I'd heard, almost 2 weeks before that he had already talked to their board of trustees about the likelihood that he was stepping down. It was not fully decided, but that was expected. So it was known. And of course, Mike and Nick share an agent. So, I mean, this stuff gets around. But
that one guy.
but anyway, with Saban stepping down, I think that opens up the whole recruiting game in the Southeast in a different way. I mean, Georgia's still going to be a monster, and they're going to be even more of a monster with Saban out of the way. But Georgia can only take so many guys, and the real question is whether Florida State, especially on the defensive side, where a lot of defensive recruits in particular went to Alabama to play for Saban, not because it's Alabama, but because Nick Saban was there. I'm of the view that Florida State, I think you'll start to see it in the 2025 class. You're going to start seeing FSU land another 2 to 3 high-level defensive prospects per cycle just because Saban's not at Alabama.
Yeah, it's
and
huge.
That's an enormous difference. They do need to improve how well they're handling things on the defensive line. I think edge, defensive tackle, you need to recruit more high level, 5-star type instant impact guys on the lines. You have to. I'm of the view that the transfer portal is great. You can do a lot of supplementation of your roster and fill holes on the transfer portal, but it's very difficult and very expensive to fill the line of scrimmage out from the portal. You have to recruit the line of scrimmage well in the high school ranks,
Especially
in
outside.
order to maximize your overall roster talent depth, and to maximize what kind of players you have. You can pick up some skill guys in the portal, I think, a little bit more easily year in, year out. So they're going to have to do that, but I think it just got a lot easier because you've got one fewer buzzsaw program that's going to have a trump card to play over you that recruits heavily in your state. Now, essentially, Georgia's going to get the guys that they're going to get. I think Florida is in a position where, your head coach there is probably a dead man walking, looking at their schedule for next year. Miami's going to get players that they're going to get, and they're going to be better too because of Saban not being in South Florida. But Miami and Florida State are going to be, I think, the biggest beneficiaries of Saban stepping down in the recruiting game, and I think that ultimately has some significant upstream effects on how Florida State will look, especially in the trenches moving forward.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think you talked about it kind of like there's a few positions I agree that I might have switched up if I was in charge of it that I would like to have seen upgraded. But also you do have, when you decide to keep them, you have that increased continuity. And when you look around the country, all of a sudden that's, it's 1 year removed from Saban, but it's another year added on to Mike Norvell. A lot of people forget how young he was when he took over the coaching, position, didn't have really any ties to Florida. You add a Patrick Surtain. You're seeing what that's doing at American Heritage already. Like, it's crazy. Some big guy names. You're really seeing a lot of more offers go out for blue chip linebackers and defensive ends, like you talked about. So yeah, I absolutely love it. We're getting right down here on the end. If there's anything in particular you wanted to plug or just talk about here the last couple minutes, the stage is yours, my man. I'm not sure what's going on with Jen. She may have had an issue with her babies, but I'm sure she'll probably pop on here before in a
mine
minute.
are out in the hallway hollering right now, just trying to their patience is running out a little bit. But no, I mean, I think I still think moving into the 2024 season, I do think that there's still going to be some interesting stuff that'll happen in terms of this roster and fleshing it out, and building out exactly what they want. There are some guys I'm really interested in seeing over the course of the next few months. I mean, I think KJ Sampson is a guy that how he develops over the course of spring through the summer and into camp next year, I think he's going to have a lot of influence on how on how good this team is. If they can add a top level defensive tackle in the through the portal after the spring, I think they need to. But Sampson, if he develops as they hope and as he kind of flashed last year at times, he can minimize the need for that because he really is a guy that is very much a traditional Odell Higgins type defensive tackle with a lot of upside. That's a guy to keep an eye on. And I'm curious to see sort of what happens with those young backers as well. I think they got 5 or 6 guys that all could pop and start to really click if if they take to Randy's coaching well. It's just a matter of who does, and you want to have 4 in your rotation that you feel really good about. Who's that going to be? I think this is a team that has maybe a higher floor than a lot of people realize. Just not quite the star depth that they had, or the heights of the stars that they had with Verse and the rest last year. But it's going to be really interesting. Still just a few little things.
10-4, man. I love it. I could not agree more. We have absolutely loved the analysis, and you're more than welcome anytime. Who knows when we could have you back on before the season, maybe after the spring game, before it, to break it down. Anytime. We really appreciate it, brother. Again, Unconquered podcast. He's on YouTube. He's on all the different platforms, audio-wise. We really appreciate you guys. Jen, did you have anything before we could close this one down?
No, I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming on, like, your show with your player breakdowns. I love it. I listen to it when I work out. It's like one of my favorites. So I absolutely appreciate you giving us the honor of coming on and discussing this with us, because it's always fun.
Well, thanks a lot. I definitely wouldn't choose to listen to my show during workouts, but hey, to each their own. I might go with maybe a little more lean toward a little bit more Van Halen, or maybe some good some sort of good beat with some rap or something. But hey, if that works for you, then great.
Different shows for different folks.
I like to learn. I just like to learn.
We are up against a hard deadline, but thanks again. Thank you, Knoll Nation. If you're a member or want to join, catch us in a few 5-10 minutes. We'll be getting started with Freddie. Thank you again. Another episode of the Renegade Rundown. We will catch you next time.
Man, Freddie's good
Thank
people,
you.
man.